In this screencast, we're going to actively recap and review all of the work that we've covered so far for the media section of the Component 1 A-Level Sociology exam. So this screencast is an example of what we call space practice, where we go back and study important older information to keep it fresh, and that's essential for a 2-year A-Level linear programme. And as this screencast is going to be quite a bit longer than normal, as we're going to review all of the main topics that we've covered so far, I would encourage you to do this screencast in several sittings. So watch a little bit, do some of the activities, then have a break and come back and do a bit more, rather than trying to watch it all in one go. So let's begin by actively reviewing the material that we did as part of our introduction to this component. So in our first few lessons on this topic, these were the 3 questions that we considered. And what I want you to do initially is to hit the pause button and write down an answer to this particular question. What are the mass media? So hit the pause button and write down your answer now. Now remember that the term media is the plural of the word medium, and medium in this context means a channel of communication. So when we talk about the mass media, we're talking about any form of communication that can reach a large audience. So of course we're talking about older forms of mass media, such as newspapers and radio. We're talking about television, and we're talking about new forms of digital and internet-based media. The second key question that we considered during our introduction to this particular topic is this one: what kind of impact does the media have on its audience? And of course there are 2 extreme positions that we can take when considering the impact of the mass media. Position number 1 is the idea that audiences are relatively passive and weak, and the media therefore exerts a very strong influence on their ideas, their ways of thinking and their behaviour. And of course the other extreme is to invert that relationship and to say that actually it's the audience that are strong and the media tends to simply reflect the wishes and desires of the audience. Now during our introduction to media, we linked position number 1 to the Marxist perspective. So the next thing that I would like you to do as part of your active review is to hit the pause button and write a short paragraph explaining the Marxist perspective on the impact of the mass media on the audience. So hit the pause button and write that paragraph. So remember, the basic Marxist argument is that within our capitalist society, most of the mass media is largely under the control of the capitalist ruling class, or the bourgeoisie. And from a Marxist perspective, the bourgeoisie use the media as a source of ideological power. In other words, Marxists argue that the capitalist ruling class use the media to control what people think. And in doing so, they have the ability to shape people's minds in terms that favour the interests of the capitalist ruling class. The third key question that we considered as part of our introduction to media sociology was this one: how has the role of the mass media changed? And in particular, we focused on the distinction between the so-called old media and the new media. So as your next bit of active recall practice, hit the pause button and write down a short paragraph explaining the difference between the old and the new mass media. So old forms of mass media are essentially print-based media, so things like newspapers, books, physical magazines, and also analog broadcasts, so television and radio before the switch over to digital technology. And these older forms of mass media involved predominantly a one-way communication between a producer and a mass audience. So the audience weren't able to produce their own user-generated content. They were largely simply consumers of media text that had been produced by media professionals. When we talk about new forms of the mass media, what we are talking about are media that are based on digital computers, such as the internet, digital television, and digital radio, and many forms of new media involve two-way communication. So audiences are not just consumers of media content, they can also produce their own user-generated content. Remember that we use the term Web 2.0 to describe the way in which our use of the internet has become much more interactive and much more based on active participation than was previously the case. So for these reasons, the media theorist David Gauntlet argues that the media are no longer simply consumers of media content, they are prosumers of media content. In other words, they have this dual role, being both producers as well as consumers of media content. And we illustrated these arguments in class by looking at the concept of citizen journalism and the way in which wireless communication devices, particularly smartphones, have empowered protesters during recent social and political movements and have turned them into citizen journalists. Remember that the concept of citizen journalism is based on the idea of ordinary people rather than media professionals playing an active role in the process of collecting, reporting, analysing and disseminating the news. The second media topic that we considered was ownership and control of the media. The first thing that we did on this topic was to describe and analyse patterns of ownership in the media, and the most important trend that we identified was the trend towards media concentration. So what I would like you to do next is to hit the pause button and write down a definition of media concentration, and if you can, see if you can identify one or two concrete examples that illustrate the concept of media concentration. So as you can see from this quotation, media concentration describes a situation where fewer and fewer large companies own what we see, hear and read. And this particular graph illustrates the trend towards media concentration in America. So as we can see here in the early 1980s, there was a lot of competition in the American media market. There were 50 different companies that owned a majority of the US media. But by the time that we get to the early part of the 21st century, that has been concentrated into just 5 companies. And those of you with good memories might remember that media concentration is related to the concept of an oligopoly. So an oligopoly is a situation where you've got very limited competition in a marketplace because there are only a very small number of companies that dominate that market. A concrete example from this country that illustrates the concept of media concentration is ownership of newspapers. So over half of our newspapers are controlled by just 2 billionaires, and over 3/4 of newspapers sold in the UK are controlled by just 6 billionaires. Okay, in a moment, what I'd like you to do next as part of your active recall is to hit the pause button and see if you can write down and identify 2 or 3 reasons why many people are very concerned about this trend towards media concentration. So hit the pause button, see if you can identify 2 or 3 reasons why many people are worried about media concentration. So one key concern is the issue of diversity, because in society, particularly from the point of view of politics and democracy, people need to be informed. People need to be able to listen to a range of different opinions and viewpoints in order to make rational political decisions. And people are worried that if the media is controlled by a handful of companies with a strong political bias, then that might prevent that diversity of opinion. Secondly, people are also concerned about the political power of media owners. So if we take somebody like Rupert Murdoch, people in the UK have been concerned that Murdoch uses his media power to assert his own political and economic agendas. And then thirdly, people also worried that certain media companies, if they become very big and very powerful, they might be in a position to actually censor or prevent information that may be damaging to either their advertisers or to themselves, even if that information is in fact in the public interest. Now, the second thing that we did on the ownership and control topic is we described and evaluated sociological views on the ownership and control of the media. So we tried to answer this key question, who controls the media, from the perspectives of Marxism, neo-Marxism and pluralism. And what I would like you to do next as part of your active recall is to hit the pause button and write a short paragraph explaining how each of these perspectives, Marxism, neo-Marxism and pluralism, would go about answering this key question, who controls the media. So hit the pause button and have a go at doing that. So hopefully you've remembered that the traditional Marxist perspective argues that media owners directly control media content. And according to this view, the owners of the media use their media businesses to advance their own economic interests, their own political power, and to spread the dominant ideology of the ruling class. And remember that in relation to the Marxist argument that media owners like Rupert Murdoch use the media to advance their own economic and political interests, the Leveson inquiry, the inquiry that was set up in the wake of the phone hacking scandal, uncovered a range of links between media owners like Rupert Murdoch and the government. So the picture that seemed to emerge out of the Leveson inquiry was media support given to political parties in return for government policies that were favourable to the interests of media owners like Murdoch. The neo-Marxist perspective recognises the power of media owners but sees them very much as being in the background. As far as the day-to-day control of the media is concerned, neo-Marxists argue that the role of media professionals, the journalists, the editors, the managers of the media businesses, play a much more important role in controlling the content of the media. However, the neo-Marxist view also argues that most of the time the media professionals tend to have very similar views and opinions to the media owners. And the reason for this, according to this perspective, is the majority of media professionals tend to come from very privileged backgrounds. So as we can see on the screen at the moment, the majority of media professionals tend to come from private schools and elite universities. The third perspective that we looked at was pluralism, and as you can see from the image on the screen at the moment, this inverts the triangle and puts media audiences very much in the driving seat when it comes to control of the media. So pluralists argue that there is a range of media output providing audiences with many different viewpoints and ideas that they can choose from, and that ultimately the media are like all other businesses. They have to make a profit, and in order to make a profit, they have to meet the needs of the audience. So from this perspective, the media reflects public opinion rather than shaping public opinion. It's the consumer that is sovereign. It's the customer that is king. And this is why the pluralist perspective is sometimes referred to as a market model of the media. The third topic that we focused on is the role of the news media. And what we did in this topic was we outlined and explained the processes by which the news is socially constructed. And we considered the way in which the owners affect the content of the news, the role of advertisers, the role of journalists, and also the organisational constraints that journalists have to work within. What I'd like you to do next as part of your active recall is to think about the role of advertisers, and I would like you to hit the pause button and write down some of the ways in which advertisers might affect the content of the news. So what you can see on the screen at the moment is a concrete example that we explored in class that illustrates the power that advertisers might have over the news. So this concrete example involved this guy, Peter Oborne, who was political editor of The Telegraph, but he decided to resign from his position because he believed that The Telegraph were not really covering an important news story involving a tax scandal with this bank, HSBC, that you'll be familiar with. And Peter Oborne's argument was that The Telegraph was deliberately downplaying the tax scandal involving HSBC because they were frightened of potentially losing advertising revenue from HSBC. So as Oborne writes here, the coverage, or really lack of coverage, of HSBC in Britain's Telegraph is a fraud on its readers. If major newspapers allow corporations to influence their content for fear of losing advertising revenue, democracy itself is in peril. Let's now review the work that we did on the influence of journalists on the content of the news. And as another bit of active retrieval practice, what I would like you to do is have a look at this particular diagram and use this image to explain the concepts of gatekeeping and news values. So hit the pause button and do that now. So the power of media professionals to refuse to cover some issues and to let others through is referred to as gatekeeping, and events that are eventually reported in the news have been through some kind of gatekeeping process, with journalists and particularly the news editors deciding what stories are newsworthy and what stories are not. And research has shown that journalists operate with values and assumptions about what events they regard as being newsworthy. And these assumptions are what we call news values, and they guide journalists in deciding what to report and what to leave out, and how what they choose to report should be presented. So as we can see in this cartoon, this process of gatekeeping is informed by the journalists thinking about certain news values. So they're thinking, here is the story extraordinary. Is there a human interest angle? Is it about a celebrity or rich country? Is the story dramatic enough? So these are concrete examples of news values. However, the influence that media professionals have on the content of the news has been reduced by the reduction of staff and other forms of cost cutting within media news organisations. And here, when we're talking about these organisational constraints that journalists have to work under, a key concept to remember is the concept of journalism. So hit the pause button and see if you can remember what this term journalism means. So journalism, remember, is the idea that these days journalists don't have much time, and therefore, rather than creating the news, they simply reproduce second-hand information that is given to them by other organisations such as the government or PR companies representing certain celebrities or certain businesses, or they simply get stuff off the internet. The most recent topic that we've looked at is the topic of media representations. And what I'd like you to do first of all is to hit the pause button and write down a definition of the term media representation. So media representation conveys the notion that something has already happened in real life, and then through the media what has already happened is then represented a second time to the media audience. Let me give you a concrete example to illustrate this idea of representation. So this is the concrete example that we looked at in class. Remember that this particular media representation that you can see on the screen at the moment was about the funeral of a guy called Mark Duggan, who was shot and killed by armed police, and this particular incident was the catalyst for the London riots from a few years ago. And you can see the reporting, the representation of his funeral in the Daily Mail. We've got certain images that are being used, and we've got this bit of text, gangster salute for a fallen soldier. So this particular representation obviously has certain connotations. And in the text that accompanies the article, the journalist writes, as his body was ferried to his funeral in a horse-drawn carriage, mourners lined the streets to pay their gang-star respects, arms outstretched in salute to a fallen soldier. However, the reality of this so-called salute had nothing to do with gangs. As you can see in this bit of text, which is a more faithful account of what actually happened, it was the bishop that called the mourners to stand on the pavement beside the wooden carriage. And the bishop said to the mourners, "We come to stretch our hands towards the casket and thank God for Mark's life as he begins his heavenly journey." He urged the mourners to stretch their arms towards the carriage as he prayed. So what we see with the Daily Mail's article that we saw on the previous slide is we see the way in which something has happened, and then it's represented to the audience, and in the representation the original meaning completely changes. So one of the key issues when we're exploring media representations is the extent to which they are accurate and a faithful representation of events that have happened, or whether or not they are distorted, whether or not the representation actually distorts the original meaning of the event that's happened, as was the case with the Daily Mail's coverage of Mark Duggan's funeral. Now, in relation to this particular topic, media representations, all that we've looked at together in class so far are media representations of ethnicity. So when we're considering the way in which social groups, such as ethnic minorities, are represented in the media, one issue that we need to be aware of is the issue of underrepresentation. So underrepresentation is when some group doesn't appear in the media as often as they do in reality, in society. And Gay Tuchman has coined the term symbolic annihilation to describe the way in which certain social groups are rendered invisible by sections of the mass media. The other key issue is misrepresentation. So this is when a social group does appear in the media, but the media gives a false or misleading account of the nature of that particular group, through, for example, stereotypical representations of a social group. So what I'd like you to do next as part of your active recall is to hit the pause button and write down a definition in your own words of the term stereotype. And a stereotype is a generalized, oversimplified view of the features of a particular social group, allowing for very few individual differences between members of that particular group. And through the screencasts and the last few lessons, we looked at a range of stereotypes and misrepresentations of ethnic minority groups within the British media. Now, obviously, what I've given you in this review and recap video is a very broad overview, and we went into all of the topics that we've covered in this screencast in much more detail in class. And remember, if you want to go back through, particularly anything that you found difficult in this review and recap session, I would encourage you to go back to the original screencasts where you will get much more detail. Remember, part of the reason for creating these screencasts is to essentially give you a teacher on demand so that you can go back and revise and revisit certain topics whenever you like. So try and engage in this space practice that I've exemplified through this video as much as possible, because it will really help with the challenge of remembering everything for a 2-year linear A-level.